The mountains do not care about your plans or your prayers. They sit as silent, jagged sentinels of granite and frozen earth, watching the slow crawl of humanity with a cold and ancient indifference. In the Comanche Peak wilderness of Colorado, the terrain is a jagged maze of lodgepole pines and treacherous scree slopes that can swallow a secret and hold it for an eternity. The air up here is thin and hungry, stripping the heat from your skin the moment the sun dips behind the peaks. It is a place where the silence is not an absence of sound, but a heavy physical weight that presses against your eardrums. People come here to find themselves, but all too often, the wilderness finds them first. It was into this unforgiving landscape that a small group of hikers stepped on the 2nd of October 1999. Jaryd Atadero was a man looking for a bit of solace, a father trying to navigate the complexities of life while raising 2 young children. He had joined a group of Christian singles for a weekend outing, a chance to breathe the mountain air and share the trail with like-minded adults. With him were his daughter and his 3-year-old son, Jaryd. Jaryd was a burst of energy in a small frame, a boy who saw the world as a series of wonders to be chased. He wore a bright blue fleece jacket, sturdy little hiking boots, and a pair of sweatpants. To the adults in the group, the trail seemed safe enough, a well-worn path through the Big Thompson Canyon that didn't suggest any immediate danger. They were 11 adults, a collective wall of eyes and ears that should have been more than enough to keep a toddler safe. The group began their ascent toward the Big Thompson River, the sound of rushing water providing a rhythmic backdrop to their conversation. Jaryd was full of the restless spirit that defines early childhood, running ahead a few paces and then doubling back to the safety of the adults. He was playing a game of light and shadow, darting between the trees like a forest sprite. The hikers were spread out in a loose line, some chatting in pairs, others lost in their own thoughts. At one point, Jaryd ran ahead to join the leaders of the pack, 2 men who were setting a steady pace toward the bridge. It was a mundane moment, the kind of insignificant beat in time that you never think to memorize until it becomes the last thing you have left. Somewhere near a bend in the trail, the distance between Jaryd and the nearest adult grew to a mere 50 feet. It was a gap that could be crossed in a matter of seconds by a grown man. The boy rounded a curve, his small boots crunching on the dry needles and gravel. When the 2 men at the front of the line reached the spot where they expected to see the boy, the trail was empty. The path ahead was a straight shot for several yards, flanked by dense brush and steep inclines. There was no sound of a struggle, no cry for help, and no frantic rustle of branches. Jaryd Atadero had simply ceased to exist in the physical space of the Colorado wilderness. The initial confusion was brief, quickly replaced by a cold, prickling sensation of dread. The group called out his name, their voices bouncing off the canyon walls and returning to them hollow and mocking. They searched the immediate area, checking behind boulders and under the low-hanging branches of the pines. They expected to find him hiding, perhaps playing a game, or maybe he had tripped and fallen into a shallow depression. But as the minutes ticked by, the scale of the situation began to settle into their bones. 11 adults had been within earshot, and yet not one of them had heard a single thing. The mountain had pulled a 3-year-old into its shadow without so much as a whisper. By the time the sun began its descent toward the horizon, the search had shifted from a frantic family effort to a full-scale emergency operation. The Larimer County Sheriff's Department was notified, and soon the quiet canyon was flooded with the sound of rotors and the harsh glare of searchlights. This was not a casual disappearance. This was a high-priority case involving a child in a hostile environment. Search and rescue teams arrived with specialized gear, thermal imaging, and a resolve to find the boy before the mountain temperature dropped below freezing. They moved in grids, their boots heavy on the earth, their eyes scanning every inch of the rugged terrain for a flash of blue fleece or the tread of a tiny sneaker. The scent dogs were brought in, the elite trackers of the canine world, capable of picking up a trail that is days old. These were animals trained to ignore distractions and focus solely on the unique biological signature of the missing person. But when they reached the last known location of Jaryd Atadero, something strange happened. The dogs didn't lead the handlers down the trail or into the woods. They paced in tight, confused circles, their tails tucked, their whimpers cutting through the mountain air. It was as if the scent trail didn't end, it simply vanished, as if the boy had been lifted vertically off the face of the earth. The handlers looked at each other in the dim light, a silent acknowledgement passing between them that this was not following the rules of nature. Days turned into a week, and the search grew to include hundreds of volunteers, helicopters with infrared sensors, and even divers to check the river. The Big Thompson River was running high and cold, but there was no sign of a body caught in the rocks or floating in the eddies. The infrared cameras, which should have picked up the heat signature of a living child against the cold ground, returned nothing but the static of the wilderness. The weather turned sour, bringing snow and biting winds that hampered the efforts and buried any potential footprints under a white shroud. Jaryd Atadero stood at the base of the mountain, his face a mask of exhaustion and grief, watching the mountain that had stolen his son. The search was eventually called off, a decision that feels like a death sentence to those left behind. The official reports were filled with theories about mountain lions or abductions, but none of them fit the physical evidence. A mountain lion is a messy killer. It leaves tracks, blood, and a trail of dragged remains. An abductor would have had to move through 11 adults on a narrow trail without being seen or heard, a feat that bordered on the impossible. The case went cold, settling into the archives of the Unexplained, leaving a father to spend the next 4 years wondering if his son was still out there, lost in a place where the sun never reached. 4 years later, in June of 2003, 2 hikers were exploring an area high above the trail where Jaryd had vanished. They were off the beaten path, scrambling up a steep, treacherous ridge that required significant effort for a grown adult to navigate. It was an area that search teams had scouted from the air, but had largely ignored on foot because it was deemed inaccessible for a 3-year-old. As they reached a flat ledge overlooking the canyon, they saw something that didn't belong in the gray and brown of the rock. It was a flash of faded blue. Lying on the ledge were the remains of Jaryd Atadero's clothing. The blue fleece jacket was there, along with his pants and his tiny sneakers. But the sight was not one of closure. It was one of profound horror. The clothes were not scattered as if by a predator. They were found in a state that defied logic. One of the sneakers was sitting upright, its laces still tied with no foot inside. The pants and the jacket were found in a way that suggested they had been removed with care, or perhaps something more unsettling. The most chilling detail was that the clothing had been turned inside out. When investigators arrived at the scene, they found a small fragment of a skull and a single tooth. There was no other bone material, no shirt, and no signs of a struggle. The location was 550 feet above the trail where he had disappeared, a vertical climb through dense brush and jagged rock that a toddler could not have accomplished on his own. If a mountain lion had taken him, why were the clothes not shredded? Why were the shoes still tied and sitting neatly on the ledge? A predator eats the meat and leaves the scraps, but it does not undress its prey and turn its clothing inside out before tossing the remains on a high-altitude altar. The forensic analysis of the clothing only deepened the mystery. There was a lack of significant blood staining that one would expect from a violent animal attack. The fibers of the fleece showed no signs of being dragged through the brush. It was as if the clothes had been placed there clean and intact and then left to the elements for 4 years. The skull fragment showed signs of a puncture, which the coroners attributed to a feline tooth. But this did not explain the condition of the garments. The narrative that the authorities tried to weave felt thin and brittle, a desperate attempt to put a period at the end of a sentence that didn't make sense. The cynicism of the investigator comes from seeing these patterns repeat across the map. You look at the map of the Comanche Peak wilderness, and you see the dots where people have blinked out of existence. You see the clusters in the high country, the places where the terrain is the most vertical and the least forgiving. It is not just about a boy who went missing. It is about the way he went missing. It is about the silence of the witnesses and the failure of the dogs. It is about the way the mountain seems to fold in on itself, creating pockets where the laws of physics and biology seem to hesitate. There is a theory that circulates in the dark corners of the search and rescue community, spoken in low voices over coffee in the early hours of the morning. It is the idea that there are things in these woods that do not belong to our understanding of the natural world. Some call them shadows, others speak of portals or ancient entities that have always called the high places home. They suggest that Jaryd Atadero did not walk up that mountain, but was taken there by something that moves through the trees without touching the ground. It is a thought that keeps you awake at night, wondering what kind of intelligence would leave a pair of tied sneakers on a ledge as a taunting monument to a life cut short. Jaryd Atadero spent years fighting for answers, pushing back against the official narrative that his son was simply a victim of a hungry cat. He looked at the pictures of the clothes and saw the same thing the investigators chose to ignore. He saw a mystery that defied the natural order. He saw the inside-out pants and the neatly placed shoes, and he knew that whatever happened to Jaryd on that October afternoon was not a simple accident of nature. The grief of a parent is a heavy burden, but the burden of an unresolved truth is a weight that can crush the soul. The mountain still stands there, overlooking the Big Thompson Canyon, its peaks dusted with snow, even in the height of summer. It keeps its secrets well buried under layers of granite and the deafening silence of the wilderness. If you walk that trail today, you might feel a sudden chill even when the sun is at its zenith. You might find yourself looking over your shoulder, checking the gap between you and the person behind you. You might realize that in the eyes of the mountain, we are nothing more than fleeting shadows, easily erased and just as easily forgotten. The disappearance of Jaryd Atadero is not an isolated incident, but a single thread in a much larger and more terrifying fabric of events. It mirrors the case of Bobby Bizup, a 10-year-old boy who vanished from a church camp in the Rocky Mountain National Park in 1958. Bobby was at a camp for the deaf, surrounded by counselors and other children, when he went for a short walk to the creek. He never returned, despite a massive search effort that lasted for weeks. No trace of the boy was found until a year later, when his remains and his clothing were discovered on a high, inaccessible ridge, much like Jaryd. In 1991, another young boy named Michael Hurd vanished in the same general region of Colorado. He was hiking with his family when he stepped around a boulder and was gone in the blink of an eye. The search dogs in his case also failed to find a scent, and the searchers reported a strange, oppressive silence in the area where he was last seen. These cases suggest a predator or a phenomenon that operates with a precision that defies our understanding of animal behavior. They are cases defined by the impossible speed of the disappearance and the bizarre locations where remains are eventually found. We are left to wonder about the nature of the world we live in and the thinness of the veil that separates our civilized reality from the raw, unblinking hunger of the wild. We tell ourselves stories about mountain lions and exposure because the alternative is too terrifying to contemplate. We want to believe that if we follow the rules and stay on the trail, we will be safe. But the story of Jaryd Atadero stands as a grim reminder that the trail is only an illusion of safety. The mountain is always watching, and sometimes it decides to reach out and take exactly what it wants. The air in the Big Thompson Canyon does not just sit, it breathes. It is a heavy, recycled sort of oxygen that feels like it has passed through the lungs of the granite itself before it ever reaches yours. When you stand at the base of those cliffs, the grey stone walls seem to lean inward, a prehistoric ribcage designed to trap the heat and the sound of anything smaller than a mountain. In October of 1999, the air was particularly still, the kind of quiet that makes your own heartbeat sound like a rhythmic intrusion. Jaryd Atadero was only 3 years old when he walked into that silence, a small spark of life in a landscape that values nothing but endurance. He was there 1 second a toddler with a plastic bucket and a sense of wonder, and then the mountain simply folded him into its shadow. The search that followed was a mechanical frenzy of boots and blades, helicopters carving the sky into grids, while hundreds of men tore at the brush with bleeding hands. They looked for a boy who had wandered off, but they were searching with human eyes in a place that does not operate on human logic. They found nothing. No scent for the bloodhounds to latch onto, no snapped twigs, no discarded candy wrappers. It was as if Jaryd had been plucked from the surface of the earth by a hand that left no fingerprints. The searchers spoke in hushed tones about the way the wind seemed to die down whenever they reached a certain elevation, a localized vacuum where even the birds refused to sing. It is a specific kind of dread, the realization that you are looking for someone in a room that has no floor. 4 years later, the mountain decided to give back a few fragments of its prize, but only enough to deepen the wound. 2 hikers moving through a section of the terrain that had been cleared multiple times by professional teams stumbled upon a sight that defied the physics of a simple accident. They found a single tooth, a small piece of a skull, and a pair of tiny sneakers. These were not the scattered remains of a predatory kill. There was no blood on the white rubber soles. No scuff marks from a struggle against the unforgiving scree. The shoes were sitting there side by side as if a child had neatly stepped out of them before going to bed. The laces were still knotted in the way a parent ties them a double bow designed to stay tight through a day of play. When the investigators looked closer, the details became even more jarring, the kind of microscopic observations that keep a man awake at 3 in the morning. Jaryd's pants were found nearby, turned completely inside out. Anyone who has ever tried to dress or undress a 3-year-old knows the sheer physical effort required to move their limbs through fabric. For those pants to be removed and inverted without tearing the seams or leaving a trace of biological fluid on the surrounding pine needles is a feat that escapes rational explanation. A mountain lion does not undress its prey with the surgical precision of a tailor. A bear does not leave shoes neatly paired on a steep embankment. There is a cold, calculated geometry to the scene that suggests something other than animal hunger. I have spent years looking into these files, staring at the photographs until the grain of the film starts to look like faces in the dark. The grief of Jaryd Atadero is a tangible thing, a weight that he has carried up and down that canyon for decades, but the burden of the unresolved truth is what truly hollows a person out. He saw the inside-out pants and he knew. He knew that nature is messy and violent, but what happened to his son was clean and impossible. It is the cleanliness that haunts you. It is the suggestion that Jaryd was not taken by a beast, but by a phenomenon that understands our biology well enough to dismantle it. The mountain keeps its secrets buried under layers of ancient granite, but sometimes it lets a piece of the truth rise to the surface just to show us how little we know. If you walk the Big Thompson Trail today, you will notice the way the light hits the peaks at noon. It is a blinding white glare that washes out the colors of the trees and turns the shadows into ink. You might feel a sudden drop in temperature, a chill that has nothing to do with the weather report, and everything to do with the way the earth beneath your boots feels hollow. You find yourself checking the gap between you and the person behind you, counting the seconds it takes for them to round a bend in the trail. You realize that in the eyes of this wilderness we are nothing more than fleeting shadows, easily erased and just as easily forgotten. The silence here is not the absence of sound, but a predatory presence that is waiting for you to stop talking. The disappearance of Jaryd Atadero is not a solitary ghost story, but a single thread in a much larger and more terrifying fabric of events that stretches across the spine of the Rockies. It mirrors the case of Bobby Bizup, a 10-year-old boy who vanished from a church camp in the Rocky Mountain National Park in 1958. Bobby was at a camp specifically for the hearing impaired, a place where the silence he lived in was shared by everyone around him. He went for a short walk toward a creek, a distance of maybe 50 yards, and he never came back. He was surrounded by counselors and other children, yet no one saw a struggle and no one heard a sound. The search for Bobby was one of the largest in the history of the park, involving the military and specialized mountain rescue teams. For an entire year, the mountain held on to Bobby Bizup. Then, just like Jaryd, his remains were found in a location that made the searchers drop their clipboards in disbelief. His clothing and a few bone fragments were discovered on a high wind-swept ridge that was nearly inaccessible to a healthy adult, let alone a 10-year-old boy with limited outdoor experience. The ridge was over 2,000 feet above the camp where he was last seen. To get there, Bobby would have had to scale sheer rock faces and navigate through dense, tangled timber in the dead of night. There was no logical reason for him to be there, and no physical way for him to have made the journey undetected. It is as if he was lifted from the creek and set down on the roof of the world. Then there is the case of Michael Hurd, who vanished in 1991 in the same general region of the Colorado wilderness. Michael was hiking with his family, a group of people who were never more than a few steps away from him. He stepped around a large, moss-covered boulder, a move that should have taken 3 seconds, and when his family rounded the same rock, he was gone. The search dogs, in Michael's case, exhibited the same behavior seen in dozens of these disappearances. They didn't bark or pull at their leashes. They whined and backed away, their fur standing on end as if they were encountering a high-voltage fence. They refused to cross the invisible line where Michael had vanished, cowering as if something in the air itself was threatening to unmake them. Searchers in the Hurd case reported a strange, oppressive sensation in the area, a feeling of being watched by something that was not behind a tree but rather part of the atmosphere. They described a total cessation of natural noise, a phenomenon some call the Oz effect, where the world suddenly feels like a vacuum-sealed container. These cases suggest a predator or a phenomenon that operates with a precision that defies our understanding of animal behavior. They are defined by an impossible speed of disappearance and the bizarre, high-altitude locations where remains eventually surface. We are forced to wonder about the nature of the world we live in and the thinness of the veil that separates our civilized reality from the raw, unblinking hunger of the wild. We tell ourselves stories about mountain lions and exposure because the alternative is too terrifying to contemplate. We want to believe that if we follow the rules and stay on the trail, we will be safe. We want to believe that the GPS on our wrists and the satellites in the sky have mapped out every inch of the darkness. But the story of Jaryd Atadero stands as a grim reminder that the trail is only an illusion of safety. The mountain is always watching, and it does not care about our maps or our technology. Sometimes it decides to reach out and take exactly what it wants, leaving behind nothing but a pair of neatly tied shoes and a silence that never ends. The pattern is there if you are brave enough to look at it, a map of missing souls that clusters around the highest peaks and the deepest granite basins. It is a pattern of children vanishing in the blink of an eye and being found in places where they could never have walked. It is a pattern of silent woods and terrified dogs and clothing turned inside out by hands we cannot see. We are not the masters of this landscape, We are merely guests who have overstayed our welcome. The next time you're out on the trail and the wind drops to a dead calm, pay attention to the gap behind you. The mountain is not just rock and snow. It is a living thing, and it is very, very hungry. The unresolved nature of these cases is perhaps the cruelest part of the mystery. There is no closure, only a series of increasingly disturbing questions that lead into a labyrinth with no exit. We see the same markers in the disappearance of Alfred Balehartz in 1938, a boy who vanished from a crowded trail in Rocky Mountain National Park and was purportedly seen by hikers on a high ridge miles away just minutes later. We see it in the case of Keith Reinhard, who walked into the mountains of Silver Plume in 1988 and became part of the very mystery he was trying to write about. These stories are not just tragedies, they are glitches in the reality we take for granted. They suggest that there are places in this world where the rules of time and space do not apply and where something waits for us to step off the path. When you look at the photograph of Jaryd Atadero, you see a boy who was full of life and curiosity. You see the face of a child who trusted the world to be a safe place. That trust is what the mountain preys upon. It uses our curiosity and our sense of wonder to lure us into the shadows, and once the veil closes behind us, there is no coming back. We are left to sift through the fragments, to look at the inside-out clothes and the knotted laces, and to try and make sense of a nightmare that has no logic. The truth is out there, buried in the granite and the scree, but it is a truth that might be better left undiscovered. Because once you understand what is really happening in those mountains, you will never want to step foot in the wilderness again. The case of Jaryd Atadero remains a chilling benchmark for the unexplained. It sits alongside the disappearance of Stephen Kubacki, who vanished near Lake Michigan in 1978, leaving only his skis and poles in the snow, only to wake up 15 months later in a different state with no memory of where he had been. It echoes the vanishing of Danny Filippidis, who disappeared from a ski hill in New York in 2018 and turned up 6 days later in California, still wearing his ski gear and confused by the passage of time. These incidents suggest a world that is far more complex and far more dangerous than we dare to admit. The mountain is still there, overlooking the Big Thompson Canyon, its peaks dusted with snow even in the height of summer, keeping its secrets well. It is a silent witness to the things that happen when we are not looking, a cold monument to the missing who will never truly be found.